Hi, I'm Carol Forbes, and today I'm going to be discussing the coherence principle, which is a principle for reducing extraneous processing in multimedia learning. I chose this principle because I wanted to explore how extraneous material can affect working memory and specifically how it works in student understanding. So the coherence principle states that learners acquire information better when extraneous material is excluded from instructional messages. Extraneous material competes for cognitive resources in working memory and can divert attention from the important material. This disrupts the process of organizing the material and may cause the learner to associate the material with an inappropriate theme or concept. The coherence principle poses that people better understand an explanation from a multimedia lesson containing only essential material than from a multimedia lesson containing essential material with additional material. So essential material would be a concise lesson, and essential material with additional material would be an expanded lesson. Basically, when learners are processing extraneous material, they are engaging in extraneous processing. Given the limits on working memory, cognitive resources must be diverted to process the extraneous material and therefore would not be available for processing the essential material. The coherence principle can be split up into three parts. 1. Learning is improved when interesting but irrelevant words and pictures are excluded from a multimedia presentation. 2. Learning is improved when interesting but irrelevant sounds and music are excluded from a multimedia presentation. And 3. Student learning is improved when unneeded words and symbols are removed from a multimedia presentation. The first part of coherence principle is discussing how learning is improved when interesting but irrelevant words and pictures are excluded from a multimedia presentation. Now, in order to distinguish between the use of essential words and pictures, Harp and Mayer used the term seductive details to refer to interesting but irrelevant details that are added to a passage or lesson. And so, including seductive details such as extra words and illustrations is based on the concept of emotional interest and knowledge transmission. This is connected to arousal theory. And this is the idea that students learn better when they are emotionally aroused by the material, and that adding interesting but irrelevant material energizes learners so that they pay more attention and learn more overall. However, multimedia learning is constructed on the concept of knowledge construction and cognitive theory of multimedia learning. This is based on the idea that learners actively build mental representations based on what is presented and what they already know. And seductive details can interfere with the learner's ability to construct knowledge. The second part of the coherence principle discusses how learning is improved when interesting but irrelevant sounds and music are excluded from a multimedia presentation. So another way some may attempt to make lesson material more interesting is by adding background music or environmental sounds. This goes back to arousal theory. And this is another form of seductive details as well. Now, according to the cognitive theory of multimedia learning, learners process multimedia messages in their visual and auditory channels, both are which are limited capacity. So, if a lesson contains narration, animation, and extraneous sounds, it may be difficult for the learner to process all of that information, which could in turn hurt student performance. And the third part of the coherence principle is that student learning is improved when unneeded words and symbols are removed from a multimedia presentation. Now, according to the cognitive theory of multimedia learning, student learners seek to actively make sense out of the presented material by selecting relevant information. Then they organize it into a coherent representation and link it with other knowledge. And they are better able to make sense of the information they are given when irrelevant material is not included. So this is when the less is more concept comes into play. For example, a summary may result in better learning than a full presentation. Not only do students remember more of the important material when it is presented as a summary, but they also better understand the material because it is concise and free of any unnecessary information. So concise is the key word here. You want to present the information in a concise manner. The first related study that I found was Cognitive and Affective Effects of Seductive Details in Multimedia Learning. This study basically is trying to make an argument to re-examine how we currently have our perspective in multimedia research for a more integrative perspective. Basically, participants were asked to learn about biology with multimedia instruction through different modalities, so text and narration, and the presence of various seductive details. So they had no seductive details, textual seductive details, or narrated seductive details. And the results of this study show a modality effect. A modality effect is basically saying it depends on the situation. However, they did find that a direct negative effect of seductive details on learning performance under the text condition and an indirect beneficial effect under the narration condition were shown. Basically, seductive details had a detrimental effect on learners when it was integrated into the text mode, while in the narrated mode, it was more beneficial. The second study I found related to this principle was Animation as an Aid to Multimedia Learning. This was also co-written by Richard Mayer. They basically examined the role of animation in multimedia learning from the perspective of cognitive theory of multimedia learning. They used the 7 principles and applied it to the use of animation in multimedia instruction. They stuck with the concept that students learn more deeply from animation and narration when extraneous words, sounds, and video are excluded rather than included. This is basically because the learner may attend to the irrelevant material and therefore have fewer cognitive resources available for building mental connections between relevant portions of the narration and animation. So basically, if they're distracted by unimportant details, they're not going to pay attention to the important details. And they concluded that the animation can promote learner understanding when it is used in ways that are consistent with the cognitive theory of multimedia learning. So, especially when talking about the coherence principle, they would need to make sure that they are not including those extraneous materials. For the purpose of my examples, I wanted to use the target audience of elementary to middle school learners. So the first example I have here is a poor example of the coherence principle, and essentially the writing process is put into a diagram. There's too much text. The arrows could be confusing for the learner, distracting in which direction they need to be going in, and it is not very concise in which steps they should be taking when. This, on the other hand, is a much better example of the coherence principle applied to the writing process diagram. The unnecessary text has been removed or put into a much better position. The information is concise and it summarizes the important materials. The steps are made to be put into a linear fashion so that the students' visual cues can follow it, and therefore their working memory can begin to remember those materials. This is another poor example of the coherence principle. I took this from Wikipedia. This is the water cycle. There's too much extraneous information, especially when it comes to words, and even the image includes further extraneous material and words attached to it. This would be too much for a young brain to cognitively take on. A much better example is this of the water cycle. There's less extraneous information within the text. It still covers the important key terms, and the image supplements the material in the reading, but does not distract the learner with extraneous words and details like the previous example. In conclusion, a concise presentation or lesson or learning materials allows the learner to build a coherent mental representation. They are able to focus on key elements and mentally organize them in a way that makes sense to them and will help improve their performance.